There is a capital city where distances are measured, not in blocks, but in superblocks, where pedestrians are an afterthought and drivers are lost, where the geometry insists on order and the traffic patterns breed chaos. Brasília was designed to erase Brazil's past and embody its future. It succeeded at the first. The second is still being negotiated. If stories like this one stay with you, the collision between utopian vision and lived reality, the cities built to reshape nations, consider subscribing. We're working toward our first 1,000, and your support makes these investigations possible. The city sprawls across the high plateau of central Brazil, 1,000 kilometers from the Atlantic coast. From above, it resembles an airplane, or a bird in flight, or a bow and arrow. The shape depends on who is looking and what they wish to see. Two curved residential wings sweep outward from a central axis lined with ministries and monuments. The comparison to an aircraft was intentional. Progress in 1960 was supposed to look aerodynamic. 65 years later, the monuments remain. So does the distance between them. The National Congress building sits beneath two concrete bowls, one inverted, one upright, symbols of democratic balance that photograph better than they function. The Metropolitan Cathedral rises in 16 curved columns that meet at a point above a glass ceiling, a crown of thorns rendered in reinforced concrete. The Planalto Palace floats on slender columns, its facade a rhythm of vertical fins that promise transparency. These structures have appeared in 10,000 architectural textbooks. Tourists arrive, take photographs, and leave. Most do not stay to see where the people who maintain these monuments actually live. The vision belonged to three men: Juscelino Kubitschek, President of Brazil, who promised 50 years of progress in 5 and needed a capital to prove it; Lúcio Costa, the urban planner, who believed a rational city could create rational citizens; Oscar Niemeyer, the architect, who designed buildings that denied the right angle and celebrated the curve, certain that beauty and modernity were the same thing. None of them owned a car when the plan was drawn. All of them assumed everyone would. Construction began in 1956 on land that had been scrubland and red earth. The deadline was April 21, 1960, the date of the official inauguration. Kubitschek had staked his presidency on meeting it. 60,000 workers arrived. Many did not leave. The question of where they would live after the city was finished was not part of the master plan. The plan itself was submission number 26 in a national competition, sketched on 5 medium-sized sheets of paper and accompanied by a written report. It won because it was the most confident. Costa divided the city into zones: one for government, one for housing, one for commerce, one for industry, one for leisure. Each superblock would contain its own schools, shops, and gardens. The residential wings would house 300,000 people in modernist apartment buildings, 6 stories high, no more, no less. There would be no streets in the traditional sense, no squares where crowds might gather unpredictably, no downtown where classes might mix. The automobile would circulate freely. The pedestrian would stay within the superblock. Hierarchy would be expressed in architecture, not in land ownership. Everyone would live in similar apartments, stacked in similar buildings, arrayed in similar blocks. Equality, it was assumed, could be designed. What arrived instead was something more familiar. The workers who built the superblocks could not afford to live in them. The civil servants who moved into the apartments needed housekeepers, drivers, and security guards. The city designed to abolish class distinction created new ones, written into its geography. Brasília became 2 cities. One appears on the postcards. The other begins where the pavement ends. The through-line question was there from the beginning, embedded in the symmetry. Can a city designed for equality survive when inequality is built into its geometry? Or was the geometry itself the mistake? The idea to build a new capital in the interior had existed for more than a century. The Brazilian Constitution of 1891 mentioned it. So did the one in 1934. It remained a symbolic gesture, a clause written to satisfy nationalists who believed that power concentrated on the coast made the country vulnerable and unbalanced. No one seriously expected it to happen. Then Juscelino Kubitschek ran for president on a platform that consisted almost entirely of one promise: 50 years of progress in 5. He needed a project grand enough to make the slogan credible. A new capital would do. Kubitschek was inaugurated in January 1956. By September, the competition for the master plan had been announced. The location had already been chosen: 15,000 square kilometers of plateau in the state of Goiás, soon to be carved out as a federal district. The climate was dry. The soil was poor. The nearest city of significant size was more than 100 kilometers away. These were not considered obstacles. They were considered advantages. The new capital would be built on neutral ground, far from regional politics and the old oligarchies. It would force the nation to turn inward, to develop the interior, to think continentally rather than coastally. The logic was geopolitical. The ambition was civilizational. Lúcio Costa submitted his plan on the final day of the competition. It was less detailed than most of the other entries. This worked in his favor. Specificity invites criticism. Confidence invites belief. Costa's sketches showed a city that looked like nothing Brazil had seen before. 2 gently curving residential axes intersected a monumental east-west avenue lined with government buildings. At the crossing point, a platform would rise, later called the Plataforma Rodoviária, a bus station that became the accidental heart of the city because it was the only place where the geometry allowed people to gather without a stated purpose. The residential superblocks would be uniform in height and density, separated by green space and connected by high-speed roads. There would be no favelas because there would be no informal settlement. There would be no traffic congestion because the roads were engineered for flow. There would be no downtown because every superblock would have everything residents needed within walking distance. The principles were modernist, borrowed from Le Corbusier and the Athens Charter. Separate functions. Eliminate the street. Prioritize light, air, greenery. Reject the dense, chaotic, pedestrian-oriented cities of the past, which were seen as breeding grounds for disease and disorder. The modern city would be rational, hygienic, efficient. It would liberate its inhabitants from the constraints of history. Costa believed this completely. So did Niemeyer, who was appointed chief architect without competition. Kubitschek believed it because he needed to. The budget was announced as $100 million. Independent estimates later suggested $300 million. The exact figure remains disputed because much of the construction happened outside official channels, paid for with loans that would not come due until after the inauguration. Kubitschek had 5 years. He spent money as if he had 50. Concrete was poured faster than it could properly cure. Buildings were inaugurated before they had windows. The improvisation was total, the confidence unshaken. Skeptics existed. Urbanists warned that superblocks would isolate residents and destroy street life. Economists pointed out that a city needs an economic base, and government employment alone would not sustain 300,000 people. Sociologists questioned whether Brazilians, accustomed to dense neighborhoods, corner bars, spontaneous gatherings, would adapt to a city designed for automobiles and zoning. These objections were noted and ignored. The reply was always the same. This is the future, and the future does not repeat the past. Ground was broken in 1956. 60,000 workers descended on the plateau. They lived in temporary settlements that were supposed to be dismantled after inauguration. Many were not. The men who poured the concrete for the Planalto Palace slept in wooden shacks without running water. The men who laid the asphalt for the monumental axis cooked over open fires. The question of what would happen to them when the work was finished was postponed. There were buildings to complete. There was a deadline to meet. The first residents began arriving in 1958, civil servants transferred from Rio de Janeiro by executive order. They moved into apartment blocks that had been completed in haste. Plumbing failed. Elevators broke. The commercial spaces in the ground floors of the superblocks remained empty because no entrepreneurs had followed the government inland. But complaints were unpatriotic. This was the future. Adjustment was expected. The blueprints were complete. Reality had not yet voted. Construction proceeded at a pace that made engineers nervous and politicians proud. The presidential palace was completed in 10 months, the Supreme Court in 6. The twin towers of the National Congress rose in less than a year. Their foundation poured before the architectural drawings were finalized. Speed was the priority. Permanence could be negotiated later. Kubitschek visited the site every month, sometimes every week, arriving by plane to inspect progress and deliver speeches about destiny. He spoke of Brasília the way prophets speak of revelation, as something that had always existed, waiting only to be made visible. The concrete came from factories built on site. The steel was imported. The labor was overwhelmingly migrant, men from the northeast who had heard there was work and wages in the interior. They were called candangos, a term that meant nobody in particular, workers without names. They built at a rate of 16 hours a day. Accidents were common. The exact number of deaths during construction has never been confirmed. Official records suggest dozens. Oral histories suggest hundreds. The difference between the two numbers is the difference between what was documented and what was witnessed. By 1959, the basic geometry of the city had been carved into the plateau. The monumental axis stretched 6 kilometers from the Plaza of the Three Powers to the bus station. The residential wings curved north and south, their superblocks arranged in sequences that looked orderly from the air and isolated from the ground. Each superblock was designed to house 3,000 people in apartment buildings raised on pilotis, slender concrete columns that lifted the structures above ground level, creating shaded spaces beneath where, in theory, children would play and neighbors would gather. In practice, these spaces became parking lots. No one had anticipated how many cars there would be, or how few places to put them. The apartments themselves were smaller than the rendering suggested. Walls were thin. Soundproofing was minimal. The modernist aesthetic did not accommodate air conditioning, which was considered unnecessary at an altitude of 1,000 meters. The climate disagreed. Brasília has 2 seasons, dry and less dry. During the dry months, humidity drops below 20%. Dust from the red earth coats everything. Nosebleeds are common. The superblocks, with their open ground floors and lack of enclosed courtyards, offered no protection from the wind. Residents learned to keep their windows closed. The promise of light and air became a joke, told in apartments that were hot in the afternoon and cold at night. The first schools opened in 1959, built into the ground floors of residential blocks, as the master plan required. Teachers arrived to find classrooms without books, playgrounds without equipment, cafeterias without kitchens. The Ministry of Education assured them that supplies were in transit. Some arrived, most did not. Parents began sending their children back to relatives in Rio or São Paulo, unwilling to gamble on a school system that existed more on paper than in practice. Commerce was supposed to flourish in designated commercial sectors, modern shopping galleries where residents could find everything they needed without leaving their superblock. The problem was simple. There were no customers. The population in 1959 was less than 30,000, scattered across a city designed for 10 times that number. Shop owners opened, waited, closed. The few who survived did so by ignoring the zoning rules, converting ground floor apartments into improvised stores, bars, repair shops. The rational city began to adapt in irrational ways. Public transportation was an assumption, not a plan. The master plan mentioned buses, but provided no details about routes, frequency, or funding. The assumption was that civil servants would own cars. Many did not. Those who did discovered that the city's scale defeated convenience. A trip to a neighboring superblock required navigating high-speed roadways designed for throughput, not access. There were no traffic lights for the first 2 years. Intersections were engineered as cloverleafs and overpasses, elegant in theory, lethal in practice. Pedestrian crossings were afterthoughts, often requiring detours of half a kilometer to reach a bridge or underpass. Walking became an act of defiance. The workers who had built the city did not leave when the work was finished. They could not afford to. They had spent years constructing a capital designed for bureaucrats and had no place in the official plan. Temporary settlements on the edges of the federal district became permanent. These satellite cities, later called cidades satellites, were not part of Costa's vision. They were its unacknowledged foundation. By 1960, more people lived outside the Plano Piloto than within it. The geographic segregation was absolute. The satellite cities had no connection to the monumental axis except through employment. Maids, drivers, gardeners, cooks, security guards. They commuted into Brasília each morning and left each night, invisible in the architecture, essential to its function. The inauguration took place on April 21, 1960, as promised. Kubitschek stood on the steps of the Planalto Palace and declared that a new era had begun. Foreign dignitaries attended. Photographers captured the moment. The monuments gleamed in the afternoon sun. What the cameras did not show were the unfinished streets, the empty superblocks, the workers' camps still visible from the main avenue. The city looked complete from certain angles. From others, it looked like a construction site that had run out of money. The first residents arrived with suitcases and a sense of historical participation. They had been chosen. They were building the future. Disillusionment came slowly, then quickly. The earliest residents discovered that living in the future required more adaptation than anticipated. The apartments in the superblocks had been allocated by bureaucratic rank. Higher-level civil servants received larger units on upper floors. Lower-level employees were assigned smaller apartments closer to the ground. The egalitarian vision expressed itself in sameness of facade, not sameness of condition. Everyone lived in identical buildings. Not everyone lived identically. Daily life required negotiation with distance. The nearest grocery store might be in an adjacent superblock, a 10-minute walk in theory, 30 minutes in practice once the roadways were factored in. Superblocks were separated not by streets, but by high-speed avenues designed for automobiles traveling 60 kilometers per hour. Crossing required finding an underpass or pedestrian bridge, infrastructure that existed on the master plan, but had not yet been built in most areas. Residents learned to drive for errands that would have been walkable in any traditional city. Those without cars learned to depend on those who had them. The social isolation was unexpected. In Rio de Janeiro, neighborhoods had been dense and porous. Strangers became acquaintances on the street, in the bakery, at the newsstand. Brasília had no such spaces. The superblocks were self-contained, but not self-sufficient. The ground floor pilotis, intended as communal gathering areas, remained empty. Mothers did not let children play there unsupervised. The openness felt exposed rather than liberating. Apartments faced inward, toward the interior of the superblock, not outward toward the street. There was no street life because there were no streets, only roads. The commercial sectors, when they finally began to function, did so in a way that revealed the class structure the plan had tried to erase. The southern commercial sector, closest to the residential wings, attracted small businesses, repair shops, corner groceries, modest restaurants. The central commercial sector, along the monumental axis, was reserved for banks, government offices, and upscale retail. The division was not accidental. Zoning enforced what architecture could not: separation by function, which became separation by income, which became separation by access. The bus system, when it arrived, operated on routes that made sense to engineers, but not to residents. Buses circulated along the perimeter of the superblocks, never entering them. Stops were placed at regular intervals, determined by geometric logic, not by where people actually needed to go. A resident living in the center of a superblock might walk 15 minutes to reach a bus stop, wait 20 minutes for a bus, and then ride for 30 minutes to reach a destination 3 kilometers away. Many gave up and bought cars. The city designed to eliminate traffic congestion began producing it. Employment was the unresolved problem. The government had transferred its ministries to Brasília, bringing 40,000 civil servants with guaranteed salaries. But a city cannot survive on bureaucracy alone. It needs commerce, services, industry, the informal economy that grows in the margins. The master plan had allocated space for industry in a zone south of the residential wings. Few factories came. The economic incentive was unclear. Brasília had no port, no river, no railway, no established market. Goods had to be trucked in from São Paulo or Rio at significant cost. Entrepreneurs looked at the numbers and invested elsewhere. The workers who had built the city found themselves without formal employment once construction slowed. Some returned to the northeast. Most stayed, settling in the satellite cities that were emerging beyond the borders of the Plano Piloto. Taguatinga, the first of these, was established in 1958 as temporary housing for construction workers. By 1962, it had 30,000 residents. The government periodically announced plans to relocate them into the superblocks. The plans were never implemented. The satellite cities grew faster than the capital they surrounded. By 1963, the population of the Plano Piloto had reached 90,000, less than a third of the projected capacity. The population of the satellite cities had reached 120,000. The numbers told a simple story. The city designed for equality had sorted its residents by income and geography. Those who could afford to live in the superblocks did. Those who could not lived where the plan did not apply. The optimism of the inauguration years had not disappeared entirely, but it had been revised. Residents spoke less about the future and more about the present. They formed social clubs within the superblocks, improvised community centers and ground-floor apartments, organized carpools to navigate the distances. They were adapting, which is what humans do. But adaptation is not the same as validation. The question persisted, unspoken in daily life, but visible in the emptiness of the commercial galleries and the traffic on the roads leading out of the city. Can a city designed for equality survive when inequality is built into its geometry? The geometry had not changed. The inequality had merely found new ways to express itself. Then the political ground shifted. In April 1964, 4 years after Brasília's inauguration, the military seized power. Kubitschek's successor was removed. The generals who took control saw the new capital differently than its founders had. To them, Brasília was not a symbol of democratic progress, but a strategic asset, isolated, defensible, far from the coastal cities where protests could gather mass. The modernist vision persisted in the architecture, but the politics it was meant to embody had been suspended. The military government continued to invest in Brasília, but the investments revealed priorities the original planners had not anticipated. Security became a design consideration. The openness of the superblocks, once celebrated as transparency, was now a vulnerability. Walls began appearing around ground floor pilotis. Guards were posted at entrances. The egalitarian apartment blocks developed hierarchies of access. The city, designed to eliminate class barriers, began installing gates. Economically, Brasília entered a prolonged period of dependence. It produced almost nothing. It consumed everything. Food, materials, fuel, all arrived by truck from the south. The cost of living rose faster than salaries. Civil servants who had moved to Brasília expecting a promotion found their purchasing power eroded by inflation and distance. Some requested transfers back to Rio or São Paulo. Others stayed, trapped by housing they could not sell in a market with no buyers. The satellite cities continued to grow. By 1970, the population outside the Plano Piloto had reached 250,000. Inside, it remained below 120,000. The ratio inverted the master plan's assumption. Brasília had become a core city surrounded by a periphery that housed more people, generated more economic activity, and received less investment. The satellite cities developed organically, without zoning or geometric rigor. Streets curved where they needed to. Markets appeared where there was demand. The density was higher, the buildings lower, the social fabric tighter. Residents of the satellite cities built what the Plano Piloto had failed to provide: neighborhoods. Transportation between the Plano Piloto and the satellite cities became the city's defining problem. Buses ran infrequently and were overcrowded. The commute for a domestic worker living in Ceilândia and working in a superblock apartment could take 2 hours each way. 4 hours a day, lost to a distance of 30 kilometers, a journey that would have taken 20 minutes if the roads had been designed for public transit rather than private automobiles. The inequity was geographic, but its consequences were temporal. Time, like space, was distributed unequally. The commercial sectors struggled through the 1970s. Retail businesses opened and closed in cycles. The population was still too small and too dispersed to sustain the concentration of shops the plan had envisioned. The shopping galleries designed for pedestrian browsing remained half empty. When the first enclosed shopping mall opened in 1971, it succeeded precisely because it ignored the master plan. It was automobile accessible, climate controlled, and organized around convenience rather than ideology. Residents drove there because it was easier than walking through the open-air commercial sectors that had been designed for a city that did not exist. The maintenance problem emerged slowly, then all at once. Modernist architecture requires upkeep. Concrete cracks, glass breaks, pilotis collect trash. The ministry buildings along the monumental axis had been designed as sculptures, not as offices. Their curved facades and dramatic overhangs created spaces that were beautiful and impractical. Leaks were common. Climate control was expensive. Repairs required specialized knowledge and materials that were not available locally. By the mid-1970s, several iconic buildings had begun to deteriorate visibly. The cathedral's glass panels developed leaks. The Planalto Palace's marble floors cracked. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a series of concrete arches surrounding a reflecting pool, saw its pool drained permanently after the filtration system failed and no budget could be found to replace it. Oscar Niemeyer, watching from exile, the military government had forced him out in 1965, reportedly said that Brasília had been completed too quickly to be completed well. Lúcio Costa, still living in Rio, gave fewer interviews. When pressed, he maintained that the plan was sound and that any problems were failures of implementation, not conception. The distinction mattered to him. It mattered less to the people sweating in apartments, designed without air conditioning, or waiting an hour for a bus that was supposed to come every 20 minutes. What the planners had not anticipated was that people would adapt the city to their needs rather than adapting their needs to the city. Superblock residents began enclosing the pilotis to create storage rooms and workshops. Ground floor apartments were converted into shops, bars, and medical clinics. Parking lots expanded into green spaces. Pedestrian paths were abandoned, and new ones were worn into the grass where people actually walked. The rational city was being revised by 10,000 small acts of practical defiance. The dream had not died. It had been edited. By 1980, 2 decades after inauguration, the failure was no longer a matter of interpretation. The numbers were clear. The Plano Piloto housed 140,000 people in a framework designed for 500,000. The satellite cities housed 400,000 in areas that were not supposed to exist. The inversion was complete. The capital had become a suburb of its own periphery. The federal government, Brasília's primary employer and reason for existence, attempted periodically to revive the original vision. In 1987, UNESCO declared the Plano Piloto a World Heritage Site, citing its significance as a complete example of modernist urban planning. The designation was intended to protect the city's architectural integrity. In practice, it froze the plan in place. Modifications to the superblocks required approval from preservation committees. Residents who wanted to enclose a pilote or expand an apartment faced bureaucratic obstacles designed to prevent exactly that kind of adaptation. The city became a monument to itself, protected from the future it was supposed to embody. The satellite cities, unencumbered by heritage protection or geometric purity, continued to grow. Ceilândia became the largest, reaching 300,000 residents by the 1990s. It developed a commercial center denser and more economically vibrant than anything in the Plano Piloto. Street vendors operated openly. Small manufacturers set up workshops. The informal economy flourished. Ceilândia looked nothing like the future Costa and Niemeyer had imagined, but it functioned better than the city they had built. The irony was noted by urbanists and ignored by residents, who cared more about proximity to work and affordable rent than about ideological consistency. The social segregation became institutional. Schools in the Plano Piloto were better funded and better staffed than schools in the satellite cities. Hospitals followed the same pattern. Public investment concentrated where the civil servants lived, not where the majority of the population resided. The disparity was defended with language about administrative efficiency and heritage preservation, but the effect was straightforward. The city designed to eliminate class distinctions had created new ones, mapped onto geography with bureaucratic precision. Attempts to integrate the two Brasílias failed repeatedly. In 1992, the government announced a plan to extend the metro system to the satellite cities, reducing commute times and connecting the fragmented urban area. The first line opened in 2001, 11 years late and significantly over budget. It served 2 satellite cities. 8 others remained unconnected. The buses continued to run, overcrowded and slow, carrying the workers who cleaned the ministries and maintained the monuments back to neighborhoods the tourists never visited. The physical decay of the modernist core accelerated in the 1990s. The Planalto Palace required a major restoration. The National Theatre, a pyramid of concrete designed by Niemeyer, was closed for repairs that took 7 years. The reflecting pools that appeared in so many photographs were drained more often than they were filled, their filtration systems broken, their maintenance budgets redirected to more urgent needs. The cathedral, its 16 curved columns, and glass ceiling an architectural triumph, developed persistent leaks that no amount of resealing could fix. During the rainy season, buckets were placed inside to catch the water. Worshippers learned to avoid certain pews. The economic model never diversified. Brasília remained dependent on federal employment and the spending it generated. When Brazil's economy contracted in the late 1990s, the capital felt it immediately. Government hiring froze. Construction projects were suspended. The commercial sectors, already struggling, saw vacancy rates climb above 40%. Property values in the superblocks stagnated. Apartments that had been seen as investments became difficult to sell. The rational city had created an irrational real estate market. High costs, low demand, no mechanism for correction. What became undeniable was that the problems were not temporary or fixable through better management. They were structural, embedded in decisions made in 1956 when the master plan was drawn. The commitment to low-density superblocks meant the population would never reach the critical mass needed to support diverse commerce. The elimination of the traditional street meant social life could not develop spontaneously. The dependence on automobiles meant those without cars were excluded from full participation in the city. The zoning that separated functions meant daily life required constant movement across vast distances. These were not bugs in the system. They were the system. The official narrative held firm. Government publications continued to describe Brasília as a triumph of planning, a city that had fulfilled its purpose by centralizing power and integrating the nation. The lived experience told a different story. Residents of the Plano Piloto spoke of isolation, expense, and inconvenience. Residents of the satellite cities spoke of long commutes, inadequate services, and a sense of being deliberately excluded from the city they had built with their hands. The geometry had created the inequality. The inequality had survived the geometry. Today, Brasília is home to 3 million people. The Plano Piloto accounts for less than 10% of that number. The rest live in more than 30 satellite cities that extend in all directions from the geometric core, sprawling across distances the master plan never contemplated. The city designed to be a unified whole has become an archipelago, islands of distinct character connected by highways and separated by empty land. The superblocks still stand, their 6-story apartment buildings arranged in the precise sequences Costa drew in 1956. Many have been modified in violation of preservation laws. Ground floors have been enclosed. Balconies have been glassed in. Gardens have become parking lots. The modifications are illegal and ubiquitous, enforcement sporadic and symbolic. Residents adapt the architecture because the architecture will not adapt to them. The monumental axis remains largely as designed. The ministries function. The Supreme Court convenes. The National Congress legislates beneath its twin bowls of concrete. Tourists photograph the cathedral and the Planalto Palace. The buildings have aged into their own mythology. They are internationally recognized, critically praised, and almost universally agreed to be better as symbols than as places to work. The employees inside them know the leaks, the heat, the acoustics that turn every conversation into an echo. But from outside, at the correct angle, in the right light, they still look like the future. The satellite cities have developed their own identities, their own economies, their own social structures. They are denser, more diverse, more chaotic, and more functional than the Plano Piloto. Street life exists there. Corner stores, bars, markets, informal commerce, all the elements of traditional urbanism that were intentionally excluded from the master plan have reasserted themselves in the spaces where the plan did not apply. The irony has become a fact of life, unremarkable to anyone who lives there. Urban planning discourse has absorbed Brasília as a cautionary tale. It appears in textbooks as an example of how modernist principles work in theory and fail in practice. The lessons are rehearsed in architecture schools. Do not separate functions. Do not eliminate the street. Do not design for abstract humans. Do not assume the automobile will liberate. These lessons are taught and then ignored. Other planned cities have repeated the same mistakes. Chandigarh, Islamabad, Naypyidaw, each with local variations, each with the same foundational error: the belief that social problems can be solved through geometry. Can a city designed for equality survive when inequality is built into its geometry? Brasília answered the question by becoming two cities. One preserves the plan, the other ignores it. One is photographed, the other is lived in. The geometry insisted on equality. The humans built hierarchy. The plan has been neither abandoned nor fulfilled. It has been adapted, subverted, and surrounded. Lucio Costa died in 1998. Oscar Niemeyer lived until 2012, long enough to see his buildings declared heritage and fall into disrepair. Juscelino Kubitschek died in 1976, certain to the end that Brasília had been his greatest achievement. None of them lived in the city they created. None of them rode the buses their plan made necessary. The boulevards are still wide. The distances are still unmeasured in any human scale. The monuments still rise against the plateau sky. And every morning, 200,000 people commute from the satellite cities into the Plano Piloto to clean the apartments, guard the ministries, and maintain the dream someone else designed. If this investigation into utopian cities and the realities they produce has stayed with you, consider liking and subscribing. Leave a comment on which planned city or failed utopia you'd like us to examine next. There are many, and each tells a version of the same story. Thank you for watching.